Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to Maritime Matters. My name's Richard Dunley and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker, and we're recording today on Thursday the 21st of May 2026. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the developments that have been shaping maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond over the past few weeks. We are constantly behind on our recordings, so thank you for our regular viewers and listeners for coming back. And we're trying desperately to keep up our regular recordings. Good to be chatting, Jen. What have you been up to?
Hey, Richard. Good to see you. And yes, we are behind. In fact, someone on our YouTube channel did point out that it was meant to be a weekly podcast in inverted comments, so I did go on YouTube and delete the word weekly on that. But we have delivered 2 special episodes. We did have a webinar on mine warfare that came out, and the ANI was kind enough to allow us to also publish the ANI's webinar on the National Defence Strategy. So there's been some content. But yes, we've been slack. What have I been up to? Look, a lot of thinking about what is happening in the Middle East, US blockades, a lot of teaching on the law of naval warfare, which is interesting right now in 2026 because there's a lot of contemporary examples that you can refer to for the first time in a long time. I'm off to the Indian Ocean Defence Symposium in Western Australia next week to talk about the significance of the Indian Ocean to Australia, which is, pretty significant. That's a fairly easy task. And also to talk about EU-Australia defence relationships, which has been probably little talked about, but has developed significantly in 2026 with Ursula von der Leyen's visit and the signing of a defence and security agreement between the two. So a little bit. I've got a piece coming out in the Australian next week talking about mine warfare or the lack of mine warfare capability for Australia. Again, that was fairly easy to write. And another piece coming out. Really? It was a short piece because the editors Australian are hard. But 2, it was a short piece because it's easy to say. And I've got another piece coming out about seabed warfare in the Australian Defence Supplement in June. So that is me. What have you been up to, Richard? Excellent. I have been slaving away at teaching and other things. I do have something hopefully that will be coming out War on the Rocks in the next little bit. That's very classy. War on the Rocks. Talking about sea control and trying to explore some of the things, including stuff like seabed warfare and what does it mean in terms of kind of classical maritime strategy. So that's my my limited amount of actual interesting research stuff that I'm managing to do. Anyway, we ought to move on and start, rather than banging on about ourselves, and start talking about what's actually been happening. So banging on is the right term. We did get accused, by the way, on our YouTube channel of banging on for the first 7 minutes of our last podcast about half-remembered things. So sorry to the person who found that annoying, but equally I think we've just done it again. Anyway.
What has been happening in the region recently?
Yeah, look, a fair bit. It hasn't had as much, I guess, general attention because, of course, 1, the focus on the ongoing conflict in Iran. 2, there's been a number of significant geopolitical developments with President Trump heading to China and, in fact, now President Putin in China. And reporting I saw earlier today that Xi Jinping may be going to meet with the North Korean leader, and the Iranian leader was in China about 3 weeks ago. So lots happening in the geopolitical space. In the maritime space, probably the biggest thing that's not gotten a lot of attention but fairly significant is Exercise Balikatan took place. So Exercise Balikatan originally began as a bilateral exercise between the US and the Philippines in 1981, from my records. Balikatan, by the way, stands for, in Tagalog, it stands for shoulder to shoulder. So I didn't know that. There you go. But Balikatan's been taking place. It took place from the 20th of April to the 8th of May. Over 17,000 personnel participated. That is a huge exercise, a largest iteration to date. Participants from the Philippines, United States, Australia, and Australia has been involved in Balikatan since 2014 with kind of increasing levels of contributions. And this year, significantly, Japan. And I'll come back to the Japan point in a moment. But Balikatan, why is it so interesting this year? Look, we've seen over gradual iterations this ramp up of live firing activities and SYNCXs. I think probably in terms of the significance, Admiral Paparo summed it up when he said it's a full-scale multinational mission rehearsal for defence of the Republic of the Philippines. And this exercise has clearly evolved into a significant demonstrations, obviously being a tool that kind of underpins the concept of deterrence, and that concept that the US have been talking about in their national defence strategy of deterrence along the first island chain. So pretty significant in terms of the contributions. Australia's contribution included HMAS Toowoomba. I read something that said this is the first time we've sent a ship. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but certainly HMAS Toowoomba was there. And interestingly, from the reporting, it's the combined Anzac call sign combat team Jackal. Not actually sure what that means, but I'm assuming that's an Australian, New Zealand Army team that were involved. Feel free to correct us on YouTube if you're sure what that means. The strikes that I talked about, so a significant element of this was the conduct of a series of strike exercises, strike activities, a SYNCX. And this was coordinated by the Marine Littoral Regiment and kind of shows a shift in that strategy in terms of the idea of embedding and dispersing the Marine Littoral Regiments along the first island chain. So I mentioned that Japan's contribution was significant. So first involvement in that, they sent 1,400 people, which is no small amount of people. But most significantly, I mentioned the maritime strike element, which is a key headline of Balikatan. Japan fired their Type 88 anti-ship missiles from Philippines territory for the first time ever in early May and struck a decommissioned World War II minesweeper. They fired it about 75 k's is what I've got in my notes. So I think that is a really interesting development. And certainly you see the increasing coming together of the US, Australia, Philippines, and Japan, or the squad, as some people like to call it. Of course, New Zealand was involved as well, and Canada, but the significant contributions came from those four countries from what I can see. So exercise Balikatan. Now, as you can imagine, the nature of that activity, the demonstration nature of the activity, Japan stepping foot in the Philippines really for the first time since World War II in those numbers. Got some significant rebukes from China, who strongly criticised the exercise and described it as evidence of Japanese neo-militarism, which is becoming a theme that we've seen in China's discourse for a while now, but a real focus kind of since their 80-year anniversary parade in September last year. So that's exercise Balikatan. Richard, any thoughts, comments on Balikatan?
Yeah, so I think Balikatan's a really interesting exercise to look at as part of developing American and kind of wider American kind of led forces strategic approach to what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly, of course, Balikatan has always had a strong Marines element to it, but the concepts that have been kind of developed and pioneered by the US Marine Corps, particularly around former Commandant David Berger's ideas of stand-in forces, of expeditionary advanced bases, of using relatively small dispersed teams, kind of low profile, to provide targeting information to often land-based systems in order to provide maritime strike. And you've seen bits of this for quite a while. I think you're now beginning to see this coming together in a sort of single kind of almost coherent system. And you saw the deployment of the kind of Typhoon longer range missile system which can fire Tomahawk and SM-6. You saw the deployment of the lightweight Nemesis systems that fire naval strike missile. You saw the deployment of HIMARS. All of these kind of overlapping, I guess, kind of arcs of land-based fire all out into the South China Sea. You're also seeing reports of exercises or sort of parts of Balikatan in which US Special Forces are using USVs and even attack USVs, so kind of one-way systems like have been used in the Ukraine. So I think you're beginning to see a kind of a maturing of the strategic concept that's been in development for a while of how the United States and its allies in the region would look to engage in a potential conflict in that area. So I think it's been really interesting to watch that develop over the past few years. And obviously, the Australian Army's littoral manoeuvre concepts and how they're looking at this fits into and draws quite extensively off the US Marine Corps ideas and this broader notion. So yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I was actually surprised, maybe I just wasn't following the issue as much as previous years, that it just didn't seem to get, yes, okay, there was a response from China, but it didn't seem to get as much attention in the region as it has previously. You remember the first time that the US deployed a Typhoon that gained a significant amount of attention. So, yeah, but I think good to see that level of exercise and good to see that kind of, I guess, denial along the first island chain. I think one of the things I read also was that this was one of the first times that the exercise also focused on closing or denying access through the Luzon Strait, of course, the strait between the northern Philippines and Taiwan, which would be a critical battleground in any kind of regional conflict. So, yeah, interesting developments. Hey, Toowoomba, we mentioned Toowoomba that participated in exercise Balikatan. Toowoomba's been doing some interesting things in the region. She's been there since February. What's Toowoomba been up to, Richard?
So Toowoomba's been part of one of the regional presence deployments. We've talked about these quite a lot. These are the very regular rotation of Royal Australian Navy vessels, generally a single vessel, up top, as it were, into Southeast Asia and potentially beyond. Toowoomba departed on the 26th of February, so she's been in the region for some time now. In May, earlier this month, she participated in one of the glorious multilateral maritime cooperative activities, which involved a number of the Balikatan countries, or countries involved in Balikatan, so Australia, Philippines, Japan, the United States. So these are relatively kind of simple exercises, but are about demonstrating presence and demonstrating kind of exercising the maritime rights generally in the South China Sea, but also demonstrating support for the Philippines in particular, has been the theme of these multilateral maritime cooperative activities. Toowoomba, together with the Canadian frigate HMCS Charlottetown, also transited the South China through the South China Sea, along with a US amphibious vessel. So lots of activity, all kind of South China Sea focused. But again, a lot of this is about presence and demonstrating presence, which is a key element of Australia's kind of wider response to what it sees as Chinese overreach in the South China Sea and beyond.
Yeah, so it's good to see this regional presence deployments going on again. Last year they seemed to be about kind of 3 months in iteration, with a ship really continuously there from the Royal Australian Navy. So, Toowoomba's been up there for, I guess, nearly 3 months now. So I would assume that she's probably returning home soon. She seems to have had a really busy activity, lots of international engagement. I know that the term cooperative activity has caught on so much that when Toowoomba and Charlottetown caught up for what looks like a 24-hour passage exercise, it was referred to in the reporting as a cooperation activity. So this must be a multi-day bilateral cooperative activity at sea, otherwise referred to as a naval exercise traditionally. But no, lots of great things. I thought it was interesting that the multilateral maritime cooperative activity. I do hate that name because I just feel like say what you mean. The naval exercise or naval operation that occurred on the 12th of May, interestingly involved the USS Blue Ridge. So Blue Ridge being, did you know this fact, the oldest serving ship in the United States Navy, commissioned in 1970.
Oh, I think vessel at sea, right? Because the USS
Oh, good
Constitution.
point. Good point. This is why
So
you're
yeah.
the historian. Right. The oldest commissioned vessel actually doing operations for the US Navy.
Okay, so moving on. What's happening in Darwin?
So always lots happening in Darwin. By the way, I had my 18th birthday party in Darwin. My 18th was at sea. Very dry, but my birthday party was in Darwin. But what's happening relevant to this podcast, the Marine Rotation Force Darwin has arrived. So it's touched down with about 2,000 US Marines in Darwin to support a series of activities. So they arrived about the 15th of May. They'll support a range of exercises during their time here, which has kind of been what they do with a significant amount of regional engagement. I think it's interesting that it didn't get a lot of national press attention. I guess our national press is kind of consumed on the budget, the Iran war, and a bunch of other things. But this has been a significant development. You know, when you think about the origins of the Marine Rotation Force, Darwin really started under the Indo-Pacific pivot. Whether that actually happened or not, was a good piece by Zach Cooper in Foreign Affairs about a month ago, talking about how the Indo-Pacific pivot for the US never really happened. But either way, it was part of that rebalance. So it had its origins in 2011. Interestingly agreed under Prime Minister Julia Gillard, of course, with US President Barack Obama. The reason I say that is, and we'll get to the Collins-class life of type extension later, but I do wonder, you know, in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, that period from the 2009 white paper through to really 2020, whether that will be considered a lost defence decade. In fact, you can probably already say that now. So it's interesting.
There's no question about it.
You can definitely say that now, right? I'm trying to be kind. So it's interesting, right? During what is considered the lost defence decade, where we didn't make decisions around shipbuilding or submarine building broadly. I mean, we were commissioning LHDs and some other things during that period. Whether that was prudent is a different conversation. But it's interesting that during that period of kind of the lost decade for defence in many ways, one of the most significant agreements between the US and Australia in decades, the Force Posture Initiatives, is actually signed under that time. So it begins its origins in 2011. Of course, the Force Posture Initiatives between the US and Australia now cover a broad range of things, from, of course, Submarine Rotation Force West, which will commence next year, but also bomber rotations, logistics support, a whole range of things now. To be honest, it's hard to keep track of them because there are so many. Some relate to space as well, I think. But the early rotations, the Marine Rotation Forces Darwin, started in 2012. And we only had approximately 200 Marines. Now, that was meant to grow to 2,500 by 2016, 2017, but it really delayed. In 2014, it expanded to about 1,000 or so, but now we're up at 2,000. So I think that is significant. And I guess, you know, a very visual example, 2,000 Marines in Darwin, of the state of the alliance. And there's lots of conversations, of course, about the state of the alliance between the US and Australia, given the US administration's approach to foreign policy. But, you know, the alliance operates on a number of tiers. And I think from a military perspective, it's probably never been closer, obviously debatable. But I would say that, and I think the Marine Rotation Force Darwin, 2,000 Marines operating in Darwin, is an example of that. Richard, I'm sure you'll have some comments about the alliance, but you've probably got some comments about Marine Rotation Force Darwin as well.
I have many comments about the alliance. Fewer about the rotational force. I always find the use of the word rotational in these kind of contexts more so in the submarine rotational force. Yeah. But our aversion to ever actually saying about the kind of the depth of the connection in many ways. and the political aversion to ever using the word base in any way. So there is still that kind of that uncertainty, and that's almost built into the name, right? With the rotational force, the Marines is a bit more realistically a rotational force, but absolutely on a military level, the interconnections are growing and are growing daily, and I think it's worth flagging that it's not only the US. Australian connections with quite a few countries around the region are growing, but the depth of them with the US is just a completely different level. So from a military level perspective, absolutely, the alliance is on firm footing, and this is kind of just another element of that. Anyway, moving on, you've flagged the Collins Lote as an issue.
I did. First person to ever flagged. No, I'm joking. Of course, the Collins life of type extension has been an issue, as I pointed out, I think on Twitter, when Senator Shoebridge said that this is all because of that damned, I'm paraphrasing, but pretty much, AUKUS. And actually, the Collins Lote has quite a pedigree.
So Lote has expanded, or did expand, and is now on the point of contracting again, which is, as I say, I think it's one of the, in many ways, the worst kept secrets around. I think everyone has known for a long time that Lote was a challenge, and certainly in the public and media kind of commentary, I think there's been a lot of attention on some of the other big naval construction kind of and maintenance type projects. Obviously AUKUS itself, but also Hunter and C3000 and other things. And Lote's kind of flown under the radar somewhat, which, considering the size of it as a project, if you parked this 10 years ago or so, this would have been a huge standalone project. It's only the fact that Australia is engaged in so much in the world of naval shipbuilding and sustainment that it sort of has been almost slightly dwarfed by some of the other mega projects. So I think it's always been a very large and quite risky project. It has now been slightly descoped, well, significantly descoped, in terms of what is going to take place. There's also some interesting indications that they're going to be focusing at least some of the sustainment work on some of the newer submarines as well. So comments made about prioritizing sustainment work on Rankin. But Lote itself is still set to go ahead, and Miles, as part of the announcement, this was announced a couple of days ago now, noted that Farncombe is set to go in and be the first submarine to undergo a life of type extension starting next month. You want to, I can tell you're raring to go.
Well, no, I mean, this might be the first time this year, but I do slightly disagree with you, and I might be wrong. Although I'm going to actually point out for the record that in our last podcast, because you are the historian, I do defer to you on history, which makes sense. You're qualified. But in our last podcast,
what did I get wrong?
Think you claimed, and I'm going to put this, you claimed that Vice Admiral Mark Hammond was the first submariner.
I did, and I was wrong.
Chief of Navy in the Royal Australian Navy, and I doubted you. But then I was overwhelmed by your pedigree when it comes to naval history, and the fact that 9 times out of 10, if a naval history comes up between us, you will be right and I will be wrong. That might be being a little unfair to myself. But what happened, Richard? Can we explain for the audience who was right and who was, in fact, the first submariner chief of Navy in the Royal Australian Navy?
The first submariner CN was Ian McDougall, who was CN from, well, in fact, he was Chief of Naval Staff from 1991 to 1994. But I'm not going to hide behind that one. You are absolutely right. So Hammond is not the first submariner. Mea culpa. He is going to be the first submariner to be CDF.
That's correct. Yes.
So I'm on safe ground there.
You are on safe ground there. And I mentioned that hopefully it's published with the Australian Naval Institute, but they had their Vernon and Parker oration dinner this week, which is always a great night. If you didn't go, you missed out. But the guest speaker was, in fact, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, the current Chief of Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, and future Chief of Defence Force. And he gave a fantastic speech about the future of undersea warfare, which is obviously a much debated discussion at the moment. And I'd note that undersea warfare capabilities, by the way, make up now, I think it's 21 or 23% of Australia's integrated investment program. And that's not just all AUKUS. Obviously, AUKUS is a lot of that. But anyway, he highlighted, and I forgot the number and I wish I'd written it down, the amount of chiefs of Navy around the region that are actually currently submariners. So a focus on submarines. Anyway, back to our actual point, which is also submarines. You asked me about load. You said I was jumping out of my chair to talk about it. Look, I guess the Collins life of type extension for me is just symptomatic of just that period. In fact, we were talking about it, right? Kind of this dead period in defence spending, government decision-making on defence capabilities. There were, of course, some decisions, but not a lot that really needed to look at kind of future shipbuilding and future submarine building. So, the 2009 white paper says that we need to have a plan to replace the Collins. The 2016 white paper talks about expanding the submarines for the Royal Australian Navy to 12. Nobody ever seems to know why 12, by the way, but we'll park that for a moment, but to 12. And by that point in 2016, we know that because of the lack of decisions, there's not going to be a new submarine capability with the Royal Australian Navy by the time we're meant to be replacing certainly HMAS Collins and HMAS Farncombe, which is really now. So by that time, it's known that there's going to have to be some sort of extension program to keep the Collins-class submarines at sea. Of course, they've had their what's called the full cycle dockings and things like that, but this is going to have to be a bigger program. So this is why I say, really, that's when the Collins extension starts. And I do point out the fact that, look, AUKUS, the first Virginia boat may not be on time. It's currently scheduled for 2032. But actually, the first French boat was scheduled for 2034, which almost certainly wouldn't have been on time either. So I don't think AUKUS is to blame for the Collins load. I've heard different things about the scope question. And to be honest, in the announcements this week from Richard Marles, it's honestly not clear what's in the scope. Now, I wouldn't necessarily expect the government to announce the scope of something like that. Sometimes I think we do give too much detail on capability information. I know many people disagree with me on that point. But so in terms of the scope, we don't really know what's in it except that each boat is going to be assessed on their current state. And you mentioned the point about the focus on also looking at sustainment for the newer boats, $11 billion over the next 10 years for sustainment and the life of type extension. But we do know that all of them now are not going to have their engines and diesels replaced, which my understanding, not being neither a submariner or a submarine architect, my understanding was that was the high-risk element because of the way it involved cutting into the pressure hull. Which I understand the full cycle dockings may also, but this was the really high risk bit. And we saw the Valdez report leaked to the media, I think last year, saying that, that really the assessment was that wasn't going to be technically feasible. So I think the descoping makes sense, right? The big question is, what does that mean for how long they can last? And what their operational availability will be. And look, to be honest, unless you know the technical state of the boats, you can only speculate, to be fair. But I think it is reasonable to say that the current aspirations that these things would be at sea into the 2040s is probably unlikely. Happy to be corrected in the 2040s, by the way, if I'm still recording Maritime Matters podcast. But that's probably unlikely. But the government was at pains to say this week that a lot of the things that they cut out of the scope, and again, it's not quite clear what they've cut out apart from the engines and the generators, were actually things that were put in to bridge the gap between the Collins and the attack. So, it cut out in 2024, but there was the optronics mask that the attack was going to have. So, yeah, I'm not sure that you might be right. In fact, we might be recording this podcast in a month's time rather than a week's time, and you might be correcting me as I just corrected you about the first ever submariner chief of Navy. But I'm not convinced that AUKUS has really had any impact. I think this comes from not making decisions in 2009, 2016, and whether the attack class was turning up in 2034 or the Virginia class in 2032, we would still be here. What's your comments? I'm sure you.
So I'm not going to carry on the debate much, but I guess the question here, I think the main ongoing question is, well, what's the impact, right? And the degree to which the pushing out of the timelines led to the expansion of the LOAT from initially, I think it was, I'm not sure, it was 2 or 3 boats, but then it became 4 and then it became 6, was because of the need to cover this period in which you're only going to have a limited SSN capability before you start to get your delivery of SSN AUKUS, and even then you're going to be a little while before you get enough SSN AUKUS to have a kind of a really significant fleet. So I think it does start raising questions about that. Do we have effectively a training fleet of Collins boats, and actually it's only the Virginias that are really operational assets? There are, of course, questions over safety. Obviously, Richard Miles highlighted safety as not being compromised, and I'm sure that will be absolutely the priority, but old submarines do not have a great safety track record. And we've seen recent examples of that, obviously, in Argentina and then in Indonesia. So I'm not suggesting that the maintenance patterns or anything are the same or anything like that, but it has to be a point of concern. How long can you keep eking this capability out? And then I guess that then sort of raises some other questions about training pipelines and things like, to what extent do you rely more on Australian personnel being in British or American boats? And so in some ways that kind of highlights the AUKUS element and plays into the strengths potentially of AUKUS, but it does also raise concerns about a kind of a really sovereign capability gap in the later 2030s and early 2040s.
Oh, yeah. Look, you're 100% correct. I mean, of course, the most safety conscious people I've ever met in the Royal Australian Navy are the submariners. They don't like showers, but they are big on safety. So I think that will be kind of, their number one consideration. But you're right. Look, I think I said to a journalist yesterday, to be honest, this is obviously not the position of the government or of the Royal Australian Navy, but I would have thought there will be a period where, to your point about training, the focus is just getting as many sea days as possible for these submarines so you can get training throughput. And that is the big thing. In terms of a capability gap, I mean, of course, there will be a capability gap, because I don't know how you'd argue that in the whatever the technical state of these boats, which no one knows in the public domain, but in the 2030s, you're going to have as many available sea days for these things as you would now or 10 years ago. Although, interestingly, I say 10 years ago, but interestingly, there is a period during the Gillard government where it's now subsequently come out that there was none at sea. So maybe we have more operational availability than we did then. But we probably should move on from submarines, which seem to dominate too much conversation, and talk about some other capability developments. There's a new capability development for the Royal Australian Navy, Richard, in UAVs. What's that?
Yeah, so this is it's a new, very fancy-looking drone, UAV aerial drone. It's got kind of vertical takeoff, but then it's got kind of wings that can rotate out so it can then fly like a normal aircraft. Now, how the hell any of this works, I have no idea, right? But the idea is that it provides you with a vertical kind of takeoff capability with the range that comes with a more of a fixed wing capability. It sounds amazing, super exciting and fancy, but at least currently it is only very, very small. So maximum payload of 15 pounds American speaking, so that's 6.8 kilos. So you're talking very small amounts. The discussion has been around using it for sort of small scale vert rep type activities on to kind of warships, or potentially, I guess, from ship to shore, or vice versa, and discussion around things like kind of medical supplies or urgent spare parts, or that kind of thing. There is discussion about kind of a follow-on version of this kind of design, which could then give you a slightly larger kind of payload of about 25 kilos. But the key point with this is that it brings both the vertical capability, but also a reasonably extended range, as kind of marrying those two capabilities up. So interesting development. Not sure it's going to be changing the world anytime soon at 7 kilos, but yeah, interesting and looks quite fun.
It does look really cool. I was a little perplexed by it, only because, I mean, you can certainly see a role for it, and I guess I would assume, it's not clear from the announcement, but I would assume that this is kind of the gateway into the version that has 140 kilos, which is much more useful for moving things around the fleet. I guess for me, I'm always perplexed. And look, I'm not deeply knowledgeable on this point. So if you are deeply knowledgeable on this point, please feel free to correct me on YouTube. But I've always been perplexed at the slow rate in which the Royal Australian Navy seems to have, at least publicly, embraced uncrewed aerial vehicles. And it's interesting because when the RAN first established its first uncrewed aerial systems development unit in 2012, I wouldn't say they were world leading, but they seem to be jumping a bit ahead of the curve. And they were operating things like the Scan Eagle. They were operating things like the Camcopter in kind of 2015, 2016. I'm pretty sure that one of the guided missile frigates, God bless them, great ships, I think it might have been HMAS Newcastle, actually deployed to the Middle East, operating one of perhaps the Scan Eagle. By 2018, A22X Squadron's established. Now, A22X Squadron has a great name, but it is the experimental squadron for unmanned aerial vehicles, uncrewed aerial vehicles in the Royal Australian Navy, and things seem to be going at a pace. And then it all just seems to stop. And I don't know what they're operating now. There's some reporting online that they've been operating a Boeing integrator, but clearly you can tell from the reports around exercises it's not being proliferated through the fleet. There is not a significant degree of uncrewed aerial vehicles in the Royal Australian Navy. So I think this is a good development. You can see uses for it. Would this have been my priority UAV to invest in? Probably not. But again, we actually don't know from the announcements how much they've invested in it. It really might not be a very significant cost at all. So it is an interesting development, probably positive, but certainly, as you mentioned, not ground breaking. Now, cognizant that we are approaching time, we probably should also talk about there's been some discussion around Port Kembla as a submarine base. What's come out? What's happened in the news, Richard?
So this, to me, immediately smacks of being a storm in a teacup. But there have been some documents which have been released, I think, under FOI by the New South Wales government. So they're New South Wales government documents that have been released under FOI, discussing the possibility of an East Coast base for the Royal Australian Navy, and particularly for the SSNs. Now, there's been quite a lot of discussion. a while ago, there was quite a lot of talk around the notion of an East Coast base and how important it was within the wider AUKUS arrangement, and how important it is more broadly within the Royal Australian Navy about sustainment and crewing and personnel and a whole host of other things, and of course strategically the advantages of two bases. So this has been something, but it has actually been on the cards for a very long time. There's some wonderful defence basing sort of reports from the 1980s talking about why we need a submarine base in the east and why they should be based at places like Port Kembla. But anyway, there was quite a lot of discussion immediately following AUKUS around this. It has then gone absolutely crickets, particularly since the Albanese government has come in. So these documents are actually from a little while ago. They're from kind of that period of 2022, 2023. It has been reported, but I don't think it's ever been confirmed, that Port Kembla was Defence's ideal choice for an East Coast submarine base. There have been a number of other places identified, or possible places identified, including Brisbane and Newcastle. Port Kembla has always seemed to be the most likely option, and that's very much what has been highlighted here. The story, or the angle that the press took to this story, was the fact that one of these New South Wales government documents indicated that the presence of a submarine base at Port Kembla could make the area a target for an Australian military adversary. Now, I would suggest that that's a bit like saying that water is wet, but and why this might come as a surprise to anyone is entirely beyond me. But yes, that's what made the headline. What I do think is interesting is it does once again highlight the discussion around the East Coast base and the fact that, frankly, as far as we can tell, nothing has been done about it and no money has been put to it, and timeframes are dragging out. So despite all of the focus and attention on the need for it, which everyone seems to kind of broadly accept, it doesn't appear that any action is actually being taken.
No, it doesn't appear that. And you're right. I agree with you completely. Storm in a teacup. Although we should just mention, of course, for those that don't follow Australian naval history, Australia did used to, of course, have its submarines based on the East Coast at HMAS Platypus, which will sadly never come back as the Navy lost a significant amount of harbour frontage in Sydney Harbour. But so all of the Australian submarines have been based now in Western Australia from, I'd say, the early 90s. The first one was 87 in Oxley, but I think the Submarine Command Squadron, or the Australian Submarine Squadron, moved fully over in the kind of mid-90s under the two-ocean basing strategy. I know that because I'm actually talking about the two-ocean basing strategy next week at Indian Ocean Defence Symposium. But yes, look, I am not sure that we're ever going to get an East Coast submarine base. Certainly, there's been no movement on it under the current government. The last formal government announcement of it was in 2022, prior to the election under the Morrison government, where it was shortlisted to be Brisbane, Newcastle, Port Kembla. Anybody that looks at any of those three ports, it becomes immediately obvious that really the only suitable option out of Brisbane, Newcastle, or Port Kembla is Port Kembla. I won't, given the time, I won't go into why, but if you give it a quick Google, it's pretty obvious in terms of location. I would also say that Port Kembla is in a significant conflict in the region. Port Kembla is likely a target anyway because of its industrial capacity, which is one of the good reasons it would be good to have a submarine base there, because of the presence of industry. But yeah, it was interesting that these were kind of dragged out and reinvigorated as an issue. It's very clear that the Australian government does not see this, and understandably, I would say, with everything going on right now, as a focus. The reason I said before I don't think it will ever happen, or at least not in the near term, is, well, yes, obviously it will take a long time to build and establish it, but by the time we are at the number of submarines where it would be economically efficient to consider basing them in two different locations, this is the late 2040s at this stage, right? Like it's probably not in the next 20 years that you would even have enough submarines that it would be prudent to be basing them on both coasts. I mean, you probably see one rotating fairly consistently out of Sydney, but I'm not sure that actually there is a need for this base. And bearing in mind too, yes, it has a long pedigree, but the Morrison government announced it was in 22, but a lot of the real work behind it was really focused on when we were going to have, the 12 attack class conventional submarines. And that made a lot more sense that you would need to split them across the coast. So anyway, calling it now, if we're recording in, 2046 and we have an East Coast submarine base, you can tell me I was wrong and I will take that on the chin.
I think if we do, the idea of it being operational at that point is probably a pipe dream at best anyway. So, but yes, there has been long discussion of it, primarily from a personnel perspective, and whether or not you actually can sustain the crews out west and keep them in. But that's a whole different kettle of fish. Anyway. I think that's probably about all we've got time for.
Can we just mention one more thing?
Of course we
are well over time. But I do want to mention the Indonesian aircraft carrier. Only because...
of course you do. Why would you not?
We have been quite sceptical of the plans for the Indonesian aircraft carrier since it was first touted last year. And I've not paid a lot of attention, but... there have actually been developments, and I did not realise that. I'm just trying to find it in my notes. In April of this year, the Italian government actually approved selling it to Indonesia. So it looks like this might actually be happening. Now, the Indonesian government has said that they expect to have it by the 5th of October. There is a significant anniversary of their Navy or their military in October. Sorry for the experts there or anyone from Indonesia. I'm not sure what that anniversary is, but significant anniversary. The Italian government seems to have indicated that it's more kind of December 26. But either way, this does actually seem to be happening. Now, in terms of this aircraft carrier and why I've probably been a little bit sceptical, one is probably the rate of Indonesian defence spending, which has been historically low, around 1% of GDP, although I'm not sure exactly what it is right now. But the other element is it was launched in 1983. So this is a 43-year-old aircraft carrier. But it does look like Indonesia will be acquiring it. In fact, there was some footage that was released by the Indonesian Air Force, I believe, but I might be wrong on that, but of a mock-up of the Garibaldi where they were practicing landings. And there's an article on that on Navy News. So at least we can say there have been developments in that. It's been approved by the Italian government and it looks like it's going to be happening this year. So there you go. Indonesia's getting an aircraft carrier.
I think I said I'd eat my hat if it happened. So, but I'm still, frankly, deeply skeptical about it ever being in any way an operational capability. But we will see. It sounds to me like a massive money pit.
Yes, but I mean, there is a long history of capability acquisitions in Southeast Asia that tend to be more prestige money pits than operational capabilities. And I mean, I'm not sure if they're still operating, but is Thailand still operating? I don't think they had aircraft on it, but Thailand had an aircraft carrier for some time. I remember stepping aboard on
it. They do. I'm not sure. I don't think it's operational.
No, when I stepped foot on it, it would have been about 2009, and they didn't have aircraft for it, but it was meant to be operating Harriers. Anyway, we won't get into the debate about whether Australia should have an aircraft carrier, so we probably should wrap things up.
We should. Been good to chat, Jen. Lots of interesting things happening, as always. And remember, everyone, that maritime matters.
Maritime does matter. Thanks, Richard.
Cheers, then.